go ahead and get into it then. So I want to welcome two amazing saxophonists. I'm excited to hear what they have to say as well. Welcome Roxy Coss and Alexa Tarantino. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Andy.
Andy.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
And we're like best friends too, so it's about to be a party.
Yes, and we've been in many sax sections together, so we're having a saxophone party today. I like it. It feels more celebratory to end this season. It's been so fun doing this. Obviously, we wanted to do it in person, but we've been so grateful to be able to do it from our own apartments, and we know someday in the future we'll be seeing all of you in person and meeting all of you in person. So it's hard for us because we don't get to see your faces. So I know, Andy, you mentioned we could do a little introduction of ourselves, an abbreviated version. And maybe because this is a saxophone class, we could talk a little bit about how we got into the saxophone. So I am from Seattle, Washington. And like Alexa, I did not grow up with necessarily a musical family. Many people in my family, in my extended family, are music lovers, some music teachers, and mystical legends of great grandfathers playing trombones and stuff like that. But my parents are not professional musicians, but they were very supportive of me learning music when I was a kid. And I started on piano, but I started saxophone in fourth grade. I started on the alto, and I think I chose the saxophone because all the cool boys were playing the saxophone and I wanted to be near them. And I also loved the flute, which came in handy. I picked up the flute as my first double when I was about 14. But there was something about the saxophone that I loved. And as soon as I tried the tenor saxophone for the first time, I really fell in love. And that's when I knew that was going to be like my main instrument. I just connected with it more than the alto or the piano or any other instrument I had tried at that point. It felt more like my voice. And as I started to play jazz, that also really solidified it feeling like the right thing for me. I didn't really understand jazz before I started to play it, but once I started to play it, I was like, wow, this is really cool and fun and challenging. And, starting to learn about some of the great jazz saxophonists was what really got me into it and really loving it. So we can get into that more a little bit later on with influences, but that's kind of how I got started on the saxophone and with music.
Awesome. Yeah, Roxy and I have really similar paths, I think. I love that you said mystical legends. That's hilarious. I think I also have some mystical legends. So we're basically unicorns, which is like your spirit animal. So that's fun. Yeah. Roxy has a record called Chasing the Unicorn. For those who don't already know, I'm officially her hype woman today. I heard stories of how my grandmother played jazz on the radio, played piano on the radio during the Great Depression to support her family, which I thought was super awesome. And but I didn't get a chance to meet her. So when it came time to pick an instrument, I knew I wanted to play the saxophone because I had seen a woman named Erica Von Kleist play the saxophone in our high school, like in the local high school jazz band. I was in elementary school, but she was, one of the older students. And so I was super inspired after seeing that jazz concert. And this high school just had an awesome jazz program. They would always bring in amazing guests. Some of the guests that I got to work with while I was there were Phil Woods, Curtis Fuller, Jimmy Green, Joel Fromm, just so many awesome people. And a lot of them even grew up in the town as well. So there was great education. There was a great track for me to just kind of jump on. I don't know what it was, I think, about the saxophone other than the fact that, she played this beautiful ballad on it. And I just loved how expressive and I think shiny it was. And so to me, it didn't seem like something that was stereotypically like a masculine instrument, which, you know, a lot of people will say like, wow, you don't see a lot of women playing the saxophone, blah, 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 blah. And, you know, I'm really fortunate that that wasn't that from the beginning, like that sort of stereotype had been broken for me. And then I went on to just love people like Phil Woods, Cannonball, just that sound, that really bright but warm, sing-songy type of saxophone sound I just really loved. So I just sort of just was striving for that the whole way, and went to Eastman School of Music in Rochester and Juilliard in New York, and now we're here at Jazz St. Louis, still playing.
Definitely.
With some stale reads from COVID, but still playing.
Yeah. And Alexa and I both had the opportunity to do really cool things in our schooling. Like we both attended the Essentially Ellington Festival and competition. And for me, that was really important. I had a great school program as well. And I also had the opportunity through that to look up to older musicians that were doing it, and people like Anne Drummond, who was a woman I looked up to and I could see myself in. But, you know, also the traveling and just seeing kind of what the New York City scene was like, meeting some of the musicians who were doing that professionally, I think for both of us was probably a big part of what made us feel like we could do that too. And it helps also when you move to the city to have those connections already and kind of have people you can reach out to or that are friendly faces along the way. And I think, you know, I think Alexa and I are very similar in, you know, she mentioned a few of her favorite saxophonists. And one thing we're going to get into is our practice routine. But I think for both of us, part of it is we just really love the saxophone. We love listening to jazz and jazz saxophones specifically. And although we're always listening to new musicians, we definitely have like a few that are our favorites. And one thing we want to talk about today is how that kind of influences your own playing and how those voices, there's a lineage in the saxophonists in history, and that kind of, you can hear that. When I hear Alexa play, I can hear Phil Woods and I can hear, you know, Kenny Garrett and the people that she has really loved and listened to and spent time with and studied. And all of my favorite saxophonists that are young and my peers have that with different people. And that's what makes it exciting, is that we all like different things. So we all end up sounding a little bit different. And that's how you can find your own voice on the saxophone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me as a primarily an alto player, it's interesting because I think a lot of my favorite saxophonists all around are actually tenor players, which is kind of funny. Because I mean, aside from like Phil and Kenny Garrett and Dick Oates, Cannonball, Sonny Stitt, that's probably like my, you know, my alto. Of course, Charlie Parker, but I feel like, you know, everybody, that's like a you got saxophone and then like, you know, alto, and I don't know, everybody's, yeah, Charlie Parker. So aside from that crew of alto players, I feel like, you know, I always loved listening to John Coltrane, but like, you know, really, really some of those, I want to say like a little huskier, like really melodic and lyrical records that I heard from Dexter Gordon, Ben Webster, Stan Getz, and then even, you know, moving forward a little bit, Wayne Shorter and Joe Henderson, who I know are also influences of Roxy's. It's really interesting because I didn't want to sound exactly like any of them, but I think it's funny that as an alto player, like a lot of my favorite actual sounds come from tenor players, which is something that you can't like necessarily directly translate because of the range, but I think it's something about maybe having like a more of a bottom to the sound. I don't know if that, I mean, Roxy, do you feel like your influences lean more towards tenor because you play tenor, or do you have like some major alto or baritone influences as well?
Well, it's interesting you talk about the bottom end of the sound, because as you're listing your influences, I'm thinking those are really similar to mine. And even in terms of alto players that I like, those are my favorite as well. Kenny Garrett and Cannonball specifically were big influences on me. And I remember at one point, I think it was in middle school, there was this Phil Woods solo, and I wasn't aware who Phil Woods was. I knew it was like the alto player on the Oliver Nelson recording that I had, and it was like a best of recording, so it wasn't even a record. And I was just in love with it. It was a ballad, and I was like, this is my favorite saxophone solo of all time. So I've definitely been influenced by almost the same list. And
Ooh.
I wonder, yeah, there's something about the tone, because there's many tenor players and alto players that have a different sound concept. And now I appreciate those players a lot, but I don't think they've influenced me as much because I didn't gravitate towards them in the beginning so much. I'm thinking the whole school of, Lee Konitz, or the whole school of Ornette Coleman, or, there's all these different threads of saxophonists that I haven't spent as much time with, even if I have more recently. I never really liked the alto or the bari as an instrument. I did play the alto. I even came back to it in high school, and I came back to it after college. And I even played in the Diva Jazz Orchestra on the alto at one point. I ended up having a completely different style on the alto. It was, I don't want to define it too much because I didn't get that deep into it. So I feel like I'm like overselling it, but it was more modern. It was more like angular and modern than my tenor playing. And I feel like that's because the typical alto and bari sound and like style that became popular is like, I just never was drawn to it. And I don't know if that's because of the people who made it popular, or if it's the actual sound of the instrument, or what, but there's just something about the tenor that always felt like home. Mm-hmm. And part of it later on, as I became more well versed, is the fact that it's, I think, the key that it's in. Like when I play in the key of B flat, I'm at home. So even going to soprano, that's not an issue. But when I'm playing on the alto, and I've really only put the bari like once or twice, but I get really confused because I'm hearing something and then my fingers are not, it's the wrong key. Yeah. And I'm like, forget this. So that doesn't necessarily affect listening to other saxophones, but there is something that was a disconnect for me in that. I don't know. Yeah. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's so funny because I feel like, yeah, I hear things in E flat for sure. But then I can also, if I pick up the tenor, I'm super confused. Like I actually had to play tenor in college for a couple of years, like for big band stuff. And I was like tenor 1. And I was like really struggling to learn how to solo on it because I just felt like everything I was playing was wrong. But I really liked playing it for like section stuff, or even, show stuff, sort of pit orchestra stuff, like, or like, virtual recording. Like I'm happy to do it. I enjoy playing it and I enjoy the sound. And I feel like it brings out like a different personality in my playing. And for me, the sound that I feel like I'm like channeling or picking up off of, certainly not anywhere near them, but would be like Dexter, or like a little bit more of like, a little more air and a little subtony, kind of like ballad, like whatever. So I like doing that occasionally, but it's funny because if I pick up the soprano, which like you and I both play pretty often, I feel my ears feel fine. Like if I just played soprano just now, and if you had like, put on a recording or something right now, we were playing, my ears would pick it up. So it must be something about the range. Like I can pick up like higher things in B flat maybe. And maybe it has to do with also the range of your, like my voice sometimes. Like I don't really even know. If I can sing it, it's easier for me, but it's crazy. I did play baritone a couple times, which was really, really fun, but not about to carry that baby around.
Yeah. So. Bari has its logistical problems, like the weight and the cost. But exactly. I really applaud people who take that on. We really need good bari players. I don't want to discourage you.
I know, we really do. We really do. So just keep doing those push-ups.
Yeah.
So what do you do like if you have like your ideal practice day, or, maybe not ideal, but when you pick up the horn first thing, what are the things that you decide to do?
So I always do some type of either long tone or overtone exercise first. And I generally get into patterns, like I'll get into a routine. And I like the routine because having a routine takes away some of the anxiety around starting to practice. And I find that the worst part about practicing is actually getting the horn out of the case and picking it up and playing. So if I know the first few things I'm going to do when I pick it up, it makes it a little bit less daunting to try to just, okay, well, I'll just do my warm up, because once I start getting going, then usually I want to keep going. So I do, I've changed up what that type of exercise is over the years, but I've done some overtones, and this could be or those types of things. So that kind of work I feel like is hard to translate over a Zoom masterclass. I feel like it's all about how it resonates. And so it's really something you should, maybe if you haven't done it before, work on in person with a private teacher, or at least one-on-one over Zoom, because there's going to be things you need to spend a lot of time getting your vocalization right and the way the instrument is vibrating. But I find that, that helps, starting the day off like that helps open up my throat. It helps connect my ears and my, everything that's going on internally, like my throat, my tongue, my jaw position, my ears, my fingers, everything. So overtones and long tones, which help, build your muscles. I've kind of started to go back into long tones that I was avoiding for a while and trying to work on intonation again. So sometimes now I'll put the drone on and the tuner, and I'll play intervals around whatever that drone is, and maybe different modes or whatever scales, just really trying to focus on the intonation and the tone itself. And sometimes I'll add like dynamic exercises to that as well. And again, just building up this, but also strengthening the connection of my ear to the actual pitch. And then I like to get moving. So scales, usually I'll start with chromatic scales, just to kind of make sure, number one, that all my keys are not sticking and are working properly. Get my timing lined up again. I find that especially I played a Mark 6 since I was 13 until I was in my 30s. So switching, I switched now to a P Moriat for the last couple of years. So making that switch, things aren't always in the place I expect them to be when I come back to the horn, especially if I've taken a break, which has happened a lot during COVID. I come back to the instrument and I'm like, wow, the timing is different. So I think it's good to have some type of consistent thing you can work on, where there's like less variables, right? If you have a constant, then you can compare it. Like, what does this feel like today compared to last time I touched the instrument? So sometimes I'll use the metronome, because that, of course, helps with the consistency and the timing and all of that. With my scales, chromatic scale, and then major scales, maybe melodic minor scales, harmonic major, harmonic minor. Sometimes I'll focus on one key. Sometimes I'll focus on one type of scale. Sometimes I'll just spend a lot of time on scales and go, but usually I'll do full range in the saxophone. So my low B flat up to my altissimo high F. So an octave above the fingered F. And I change up like the tonguing that I'll do. So sometimes I'll be working on slurred and getting it really even. Sometimes I'll be working on my upbeat tonguing, like jazz articulation type thing. Sometimes I'll do all tongue, not as much, but so lots of scales and lots of arpeggios. And, this is something I think is so important, because, how many years have I been practicing? And it's still the thing that I make sure I do, even if I don't do anything else, some type of warm up, long tone thing, and scales, because it gets you ready here, and it gets you ready here and here and here. So it warms up all the things that you need to warm up. And it's just, any music you're going to make comes from those things. It comes from your sound. And it comes from understanding the harmony, which all is based on these scales. So if you know your scales, all of the music is going to be easier to process and to play. Once I've gone through that, I think of that whole thing as my warm-up, really. Lately, I've been practicing some etudes, and I went back to some books that I worked on in high school because I was like, I haven't worked on this stuff in a really long time. So what I'm working on right now is the Fairlane etudes, which everybody should have or know. And then I've been working out of this book, Technique of the Saxophone. I have it right here, so I'll show you. Joseph Viola, volume 2. There's 3 volumes. This one is like based on harmony, so it's more chord studies. Like I've really been focusing on it with articulation. It has all the approach notes to all the different types of chords. So in every key, like G major, G minor, those are triads. G major 7, G minor 7, G dominant 7, G half diminished 7, G fully diminished 7. And it has the arpeggios and every approach tone, and then some exercises that are really crazy and fun. So it's combining a lot of things. And then that's kind of my technique. Then I want to move on to repertoire. And so I work on learning new tunes and remembering tunes that I've learned in the past that I maybe haven't played in a while. So that kind of practice can look several different ways. Sometimes I'm at the piano and I'm playing in different keys. Sometimes I'm on my instrument. If it's a really new song, I'll be listening to a recording of it that I really like and trying to pick the melody from the recording and learn the melody by ear. And then after I learn the melody, I learn the harmony by listening to like the bass notes and then filling in what the tonality sounds like. So most of that work I do on saxophone. And then, yeah, just practicing. Sometimes I'll use Jamie Aebersold's to practice tunes that I already know. Sometimes I will use my iReal Pro, but I certainly won't use it to learn the tune. I will only use it to challenge myself with random things like tempo, key. Donnelly in all 12 keys is easy when you can just put the play along on and do the transpose button. So working on tunes is a lot of my practice. And then I would say one of the most important things that I usually get to last is transcription. And I will try to learn solos of people that I love by ear and memorize them. And that's my process for that. Transcription for me really looks, most of the time, is learning it and trying to remember it and play it along in time with the person. I do slow it down when it's too hard. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But getting it to tempo, having it memorized, and doing this all by ear, that whole process is so important. And then at some point, you could write it down and analyze it. But I think for me, what's been most useful is actually just the learning and memorization process, getting those things by ear. So that's like my whole practice routine usually. And outside of that, there's a lot of things I work on with music that I don't consider my practice routine. So composing, arranging, listening to records. Usually I do that stuff separately from the time I set aside for my actual saxophone practice. Yeah, okay. And if there's questions, again, I've been talking forever, but that's my whole practice routine. So, and Alexa, I want to hear yours, but if people had questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
Yeah, send the questions in. That's so funny. Okay.
And now you can play the saxophone.
I know, right? Yeah, actually mine's really kind of similar, but I'm going to try to think of things that are maybe different so that we're covering. Definitely, yeah, long tones and overtones are in the first few minutes. I like this one exercise for long tones called ha-ta-tas, which I think, yeah, Andy's smiling. So I'm sure everybody, I'm sure if you're hanging with a saxophone teacher, a lot of people that I have worked with and taught with teach this exercise. So this may not be completely new information, but the idea is that it just, for me, it like kind of shocks my embouchure first thing in the morning. So you're playing a particular pitch, let's say it's a middle G, and you're just giving it a ha articulation. So no tongue, to, you know, keep it all pretty and smooth. Nope, you're just going right in there with the raw ha, and then you're adding the ta and the ta again to keep it nice and kind of clean. So and so the key there was that I did not remove my embouchure from the mouthpiece. So I did not reset my embouchure. I was same exact positioning, just breathing in and out through my nose. And so that will that's like doing push-ups in the morning for your face, because you're not getting that break from the muscle position. So I really like that. And especially if I've taken a break for a couple of days or something, or just haven't been able to do, I'll just do that for I'll do hot tatas for like 20 minutes. And when I do them just in the morning as part of a routine, I'll do G up to middle C. So ha ta ta, ha ta ta, ha, up to C, and so just up a perfect fourth, and I'll go back down, and I'll go back up, I'll go back down. So I'm just working within the range of a fourth. I don't know why. That's just the way that I guess I was taught to do it. And then I'll do, you know, if my low register is feeling stuffy, I'll do them on my low register. If my my altissimo register is feeling icky, I'll do it there. So that's a long tone one for everybody. Overtones also, I like to do those as well. And I spend, I guess, more time like kind of up in the upper partials, trying to like clean those up, and just trying to keep like, it feels like a ladder, right, of like the overtone series. So I will often just kind of like weasel up around there, just trying to keep things clean and in tune, and challenge myself to leap around a bunch, you know, maybe not in such a scalar or stepwise or arpeggiated way, but trying to skip a few here and there, and can I land it with my, you know, my vocalization. So and then from there I'll do scales with different articulations, as Roxy mentioned, and I'll just demo one that I really like. I like to work on bebop scales just to get my jazz articulation flowing. So if I get to a gig and I didn't have a lot of time to warm up or practice that day, pre-COVID, nobody's going anywhere right now, but I will do the ha-ta-tas and like, you know, just do this little bebop thing. So and so on and so forth. So that's bebop articulation on dominant 7 bebop scales, and then outlining the dominant 7 arpeggio. And I like to do all my scales moving in the circle of fourths. Shout out to David Bixler, who, when I was teaching with him at Birch Creek Jazz Academy in Wisconsin, he made a point of saying to everybody that yes, there is the circle of fifths, but 2-5-1s and like the whole 5-1 movement and everything in our music is a fourth, you know, an interval of a fourth. So why not feed 2 birds with 1 scone and, you know, get that sound in your ear as, you know, bang for your buck. So if you're already practicing your scales in that motion, your ear's just going to get naturally used to hearing it when you're improvising and all of that stuff. And that's a new, you know, feed 2 birds with 1 scone. Is an animal, you know, animal loving way to get the same point across, I learned. So yeah, and then what else? Roxy, you talked about repertoire, all on the same page. And in terms of repertoire, for anybody that maybe missed my class that I did a couple weeks ago, I love to just like practice doing bass lines on tunes to learn the harmony and really make sure I'm outlining it myself and I'm completely responsible for it. I'm not depending on a pianist or a bassist. Yeah, and for transcribing, I really like to transcribe away from my horn. I like to do it, you know, like on a plane or on a park bench or just on the couch, as an ear training exercise test first to see how much of it I can get down, kind of like a dictation. And then I'll pick up my horn and self-correct any of my areas that I missed. And then that's when I'll take to it sort of like an etude and really work on the styling of it and the vibrato and the phrasing and the sound and the tone and all that stuff. So I think between the two of us, that's a lot of information. I think we might have a question. Awesome. Braden says, Alexa and Roxy, do either of you try to incorporate some sort of composition in your routines? If so, what's your approach? Roxy, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, like I said, I don't really, my composition practice is usually separate from my saxophone practice. I feel like the composition mindset for me is a completely different one than the saxophone practicing mindset. And so, in order to get into that headspace, it's just a different part of my day usually. It might be one right after the other, but they're usually not intertwined. And for me, my compositional process and my approach, so I usually have like two things that might prompt me to sit down and compose. One is a deadline, and one is inspiration. And when inspiration strikes, that's great because you can just sit down and usually something will come out. But sometimes I'm not inspired. And so I try to keep a list of things, like an ongoing list of things that have inspired me throughout my life, my day, that when I do go to sit down and I might not feel inspired, I will have a list of things that could get me going with an idea. Like maybe I'm listening to some music on a jog, or maybe I'm reading a book, or I'm I hear something played on a TV show, or I don't know, any of these types of things. And I'll get an idea like, oh, I really like the texture in that composition that I'm hearing. Or, I just thought of like, I really want to write something for guitar and flute, or like, I don't know, any type of random idea that could start an entire composition. So I write those ideas down. And then so that way, when I do go to sit down to compose, I have something I'm starting with. I'm not trying to just like start out of the blue with no inspiration, no ideas. With that in mind, that inspiration or that idea that I try to take and compose something out of becomes a puzzle. I'm sorry if I've said this before. Some of you might have heard me say this before because I say this every time, but it really is the only or best way I've found to describe the process, which is if you have a puzzle, there's a right answer, and there is something that makes the most sense in terms of how to put the pieces together. So once I start the process, the beginning is the hardest because you have all these pieces and you don't know what fits with what or how to accomplish the bigger picture that you're trying to put together. But you might have an idea of what it might feel like once you do get it together. So I kind of, sometimes I'm just stabbing in the dark at like, how am I going to capture this feeling or this idea and put it into a musical idea? And so I use the piano primarily for my process. And I usually start with chordal ideas, harmony. Sometimes I start with melodic ideas. It just depends on what the inspiration is that I started with. But generally I'll start with chords, and I'll start kind of playing around with the movement between chords, because that creates that tension and release, the relationship that defines like the feeling of the composition. And as it starts to unfold, if I play something and it feels wrong, I'm going to know right away. If I play something and it feels right, that's like the answer, the puzzle piece that I was looking for. So I write that puzzle piece down, or whatever it is, whether it's like a chord or a rhythmic idea or a melodic idea. And so once I have something written down, the next idea must be the puzzle piece that fits with that one. And so it starts to become something that flows. Sometimes I'll reach a crossroad where I have two ways of solving the puzzle, and I'll just write them both down because I try not to edit too much in that first part of the process. Once I get kind of the musical phrase down, like a whole phrase completed, that's kind of my rough draft. And I continue to go back and play it on the piano as I add each piece and see how it sounds as a whole. By this point, usually I have some type of form for the composition, like whether it's a standard AABA form, maybe it's a blues, maybe it's a through composed song. So I start to get an idea of how the whole form is going to flow. And at this point, I also have like harmony, rhythm, and general melody. And the melody usually either comes as its own thing or the top note of whatever voicings I'm playing. So sometimes it happens all at the same time. Sometimes I have to go back later and write a melody over it as if I was improvising over the harmony. And then the last part of my, or I should say, the next part of my process would be to put it into the computer. And I do use Finale. And I think for me, it's been very helpful in my composition process because Finale can play much more parts at the same time than I can play on the piano or saxophone. So I can hear, I usually write for my band and I can hear like, if I played a bass line on the piano, I can put that in the bass part. And then I can put the chords that I was playing in the piano part, and then I can have a saxophone melody playing, and then I could add a guitar counter melody because now I have room in my brain to think about like what else would be played. So I do use the computer. And once I have like a pretty finalized version of a song, the last part of the process is to play it with my band and see how it sounds. And sometimes it's ready to go. I know exactly what I want. Sometimes I need a lot of input from other musicians about like what type of drum groove do we need here? Or, you know, I want you to play some type of counter melody, but I don't want to write it out. So can you just improvise or things like that? You know, you have to rehearse with the band a little bit. You can't just dictate every single thing all the time. But each composition is different. So that's the general process that I use, but it always, of course, varies.
Awesome. I don't even know what my process is. I mean, yeah, my reasoning for writing is probably an impending deadline, most likely. Not because I don't like or enjoy writing, but just because for me I just have to I guess that's what it is. I'm just one of those deadline people. So sometimes I'll get an idea, but I wish I was like I had that notebook of my ideas. I feel like sometimes I have a note on my phone of like if I think of a concept or a tune name even, or just like a vibe or a groove, I keep a note on my phone, but it's like really rare that I will open the note and then act on it. It's usually like I'm writing for a record maybe once a year, and so then maybe I'll dive into the note and see what I wrote. But even then other things come up and then I decide I want to do this instead. So I do think it's always interesting to like to keep that little list of things, because like 20 years from now you just never know. You could wake up and be like, hey, maybe it's time. So the inspiration could strike at any moment. For me, I always come up with like a melody first, and I'm always struggling to expand my harmonic palette. I feel like because we're, melodic instruments, I'm always kind of second guessing my harmony and like, there could be something cooler, or this could be more interesting, but then sometimes I'm like, well, this feels good. And so sometimes I look at my chord progressions or my themes and I'm like, I think, oh, is this not exciting enough or modern enough or hip enough? But then when I'm playing it, it just feels good because it's just like straightforward. So sometimes I try to stick with what my initial thought was and not overcomplicate things, not try to be something it's not or I'm not. So that's always a hard sort of line to grapple with for me when I'm writing. But yeah, I definitely don't have any type of routine. I guess those are just a couple of my thoughts around it. Yeah. So that's that. Andy, is there anything that you are like dying to jump in on here?
I do love all the Birch Creek references. I definitely did some ha-ta-tas with Bixler and Doug Stone back in the day. So.
Oh yeah, they are ha-ta-ta central. I first learned them in Hartford with my teacher in Hartford, but then when I got there and they were ha-ta-taing, I was like, oh, meant to be.
I'm curious, you guys have talked quite a bit about your influences, but I was done some talks and had some conversations with other musicians about how, they sort of have gone through a lineage of an instrument. So if you, like Alexa, say you really liked Kenny Garrett, which you have mentioned, how did that ever lead you back to somebody else and back through sort of the history of the instrument? And how does that influence your then thought of Kenny Garrett and the more modern players?
Yeah. I think I always tried to go like from left to right in terms of the timeline. So I started out, I think that's the way that my teachers, really impressed upon, just starting with, I guess, I really started with Charlie Parker. And of course, there were alto players before that. I think for me, it was like once I got into the Ellington stuff, like through Jazz at Lincoln Center, and my school was getting into that, then I really started to take on the nuance of that style with Johnny Hodges. And but I think in terms of the things that we were doing at the time and like jazz education, it was important to have the type of language that Charlie Parker had kind of pioneered. So that was probably the first start. And I realized, I was just playing along with the Omni book because I was just like eating it all up. Like, wow, I couldn't believe, how much there was to learn. And so I think for me, it was like getting all the tools in that respect, the vocabulary, the technique. And then it was like, wow, listen to all these different sounds that are made. Like, forget about moving your fingers. Like, listen to all this other stuff that's going on. So that's when I think it was really interesting to go back and listen to people like Johnny Hodges. Even just like checking out some of I think for me it was like checking out the other, just the general saxophonists of that time, like Johnny Hodges, but also Ben Webster, also Coleman Hawkins, like the famous Body and Soul, Lester Young's famous Lady Be Good solo, just a different approach to the harmony than what I was already learning with Bird. And I think for me that was harder than it was to learn the Bird stuff, because the Bird stuff was like everything is nooks and crannies and filling in the cracks. But when you're playing a Lester Young solo, it's like, the arpeggiated harmony, the really clear outlining of things. Actually having the absence of the chromatics was harder for me. I don't know if that's something that might make sense, Roxy.
Yeah, I mean, I also found that older style of playing a little bit more challenging, and also didn't really do much of it until later. And I think most of that is honestly just the way jazz education is at this point, that there's a focus on bebop and beyond, that we don't actually get that focus of the music that came before. And part of it is, I mean, it really is a new language. When Charlie Parker came along, the chromaticism, the way that people were playing is different. And especially with, I would feel like maybe Lester, it's more, arpeggio based, like almost like Louis Armstrong. And Louis Armstrong, to me, I always knew he existed and that he was like pretty much the first recorded jazz musician that I could get my hands on. But I didn't understand it. It was so foreign because the music we were playing in jazz band was bebop and later. So I couldn't comprehend it until later. I think my understanding of the lineage, I knew that, yes, I thought of it left to right as well. And I thought of it as, okay, we had, Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, Lester Young. And then, I understood that people like Dexter were influenced by them. I understood that even John Coltrane was influenced by Dexter Gordon. I understood that he was also influenced by Coleman Hawkins. I understood, people would tell me these things, and that made sense to me, like they came after them. But so I think for a long time I was just learning solos from each of those eras because I felt like I should. Like, oh, I should learn this body and soul solo. I should learn a Lester Young solo. I've never done that, you know, and that's great. I mean, that's reason enough. It's fine as long as you enjoy it. Now I still sort of have a haphazard way of going about it. At this point, I don't really try to like go back, and I don't try to like, if I let's say like, oh, I want to learn, like recently I've been trying to make myself do this more. Sorry, I'll get to my point. But like, for instance, I really love Mark Turner. He's been somebody I've listened to for years and years, but I don't necessarily sound like him. And I spent a lot of time transcribing one of his solos. And usually this is what I've done in my learning is I'll go really deep into one solo. And so my most recent one was a Joshua Redman solo. And so if you say those are my two most recent solos, then you might think like, oh, now I'm going into more modern. She must have done more old school saxophonists before. And while that's technically true, I've been listening to everything all the time and sort of spending like a year with one solo rather than like I've written down and learned 100 Mark Turner solos or something like this. Like that's never really been the way I've approached it. But that being said, lately I keep thinking, what if I were to learn like all the solos on this record or something? Because I think there's language that saxophonists play. Like Charlie Parker is maybe the best example of this. Every person has their own language. And once you start to learn more than one solo, you realize like, oh, they weren't just like making these notes up out of magical nothing. They practiced these are phrases of language that they practiced over and over, and they're implementing them in different places. And so it helps you understand, I think, more deeper the context of the harmony and the language that people are using. Like Mark Turner is going to use this lick, but it's not a lick. It's a way to outline that harmony. And so it's a shape that you can start to implement into your own playing. And if you spend enough time with one solo, you could do this. You could be like, okay, I'm going to take this idea that I learned from the solo and put it in all keys or put it in different tunes. But sometimes it might be easier to just learn more than one solo of that person because you're going to start to recognize their language a little bit. So all of that to say, my actual answer to Andy's original question is actually, now that I'm older, I'm not old, but older than I used to be, I hear people's influences much more. And it's actually the opposite. Now I'll be like, I'll hear an older record that I had never heard before, like, I don't know, a Stanley Tarantino record or a Joe Henderson record. And I'll be like, oh, wow, you know, Rich Perry was so influenced by Joe Henderson. And I'll actually hear how a more modern player, like, oh, Joshua Redman was really influenced by, you know, Eddie Harris or something that once I hear the older recording, I can hear the modern player in it because I'm more familiar. And so it reminds me of what Alexa said about bebop and Charlie Parker. I think that just by nature of like what's played on the radio, who's alive today, like we're used to hearing those sounds more, even if we've listened to these other people out of context. So being able to hear that lineage is really fun for me now when I put on an older record that's new and unfamiliar, being like, wow, my friend Alexa is really influenced by this saxophonist. I never knew that, but I can hear it so clearly now. I don't need somebody to tell me that because I can hear the influence in the playing.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of Melissa Aldana was, here in St. Louis, I don't know, year and a half ago, was talking a lot about like spending time, you know, with a person, you know, whether it be Joe Henderson or I think Joe Henderson and Mark Turner were two people or in Sonny Rollins, you know, to get to know their language, get to know the thing they play, the nuances they play from solo to solo to record, and the things that really, you know, defined them. I don't know. And I think, yeah, I love being able to then go back and recognize, having studied somebody so much that you can recognize where they came from immediately in other people. It does look like we have another question here. This one's on doubling, everyone's favorite. So This is asking about tendencies as a saxophonist on other instruments, and how do you go about being immersed in the instrument you're doubling on, instead of just sounding like a saxophonist playing flute or clarinet.
I'm definitely interested to hear what Alexa has to say on this.
Sure. Do you want me to kick it off, Roxy?
Sure.
So great question, Brayden. Thank you for asking questions.
Yeah.
So sounding like a saxophonist playing the flute rather than a flautist. Yes. So the goal is definitely to sound like, it's your primary instrument. And of course that's not always, it's hard to get to the same exact level, but I think treating it like you're starting from the very beginning and trying to learn the classical repertoire, classical technique on an instrument is really important, because you can pretty easily translate, your jazz style and your jazz articulation and your jazz phrasing to anything that you do, because it's so important to you. It's such an important part of you. So really making sure that you have those fundamentals is super important. So like even just having an understanding of what the instrument is supposed to sound like, by listening to people like James Galway or Emmanuel Pahoud, or who, like, there's so many different people, to have an understanding of like what the instrument's actually capable of outside of the jazz context is super important, and it's also really inspiring, and it also will get you maybe even hooked on some classical stuff, which is like a fun journey to go on. So for flute, for me, for example, I do a bunch of sound and long tone exercises from a Marcel Moy's book called De la Sonorité. It's a French title. And then I also have these Bach sonatas that I might play. And that's just a nice way for me to feel like I'm kind of like throwing myself into the flute tradition. For clarinet, let's see. For clarinet, the Rose Studies are a really common etude book. Is it the Rose? Yeah, it is the Rose book. And then there are, so many incredible clarinetists. One clarinetist I really like her name is Sabine Meyer. She's German, and I really enjoy I have a record of her doing like a bunch of Mozart clarinet concerto things, and that was like a really great way for me to figure out what I wanted my clarinet to sound like, and then to add my jazz articulation and things on top of it. So, and then I would kind of transition into listening to some jazz musicians playing on those instruments. So there's a lot to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything. Those are like also the names. I haven't heard of Sabine, but all of the other names you mentioned, it's funny. It's like, yep, that's what I did. Lots of Bach on the flute. And, in terms of, I think one thing it's important to understand is like, at least my advice, and there's no right way to do anything or wrong way, but, your saxophone might feel like your primary instrument because you play it as much as you do. So if you want the flute to feel like your primary instrument, you're going to have to play it that much. So for me, for years, I would play the flute for a while before I would ever touch my saxophone, because I knew the saxophone wasn't going anywhere. And I had a lot of catch up to do to like get the flute to a place where I could just pick it up and it would feel like home. And same thing with the clarinet. Putting in the daily practice on those instruments is important. And I do think a lot of my practice time on those instruments was spent on like classical stuff to get a good sound and to get the facility on the instrument, because like Alexa said, the jazz concepts you're working on saxophone are going to apply. But at a certain point, I also realized that I had been avoiding actually playing jazz on those instruments, and it does feel different. And so in terms of, especially if you're going to have to like take a solo at some point, like if you're an alto player, you're definitely going to have to take a flute solo at some point. Tenor players can get away with it a little bit better, but sometimes you might be asked to take a clarinet solo, and that is really, really hard because you're improvising with a set of two different fingerings at the same time, and we're not used to that as saxophonists. I find the flute to be easier in terms of improvising because the fingering is more static to the saxophone. So practice, anything you want to do well, you got to practice it. So once you have a concept for the sound and the instrument, then you could address jazz and practice improvising in the same way that you do on your saxophone. But I think what Alexa said, just to underscore that, I would recommend getting a private lesson or many private lessons with a classical teacher on that instrument, flute or clarinet, so that you can get some advice on embouchure, sound, things that a jazz saxophone player is only going to do so well. Okay, we have 2 questions left. One from Alex, we'll answer first maybe because you haven't said anything yet. What are some things you did right away when you moved to New York to get your career started? And I know this is different for both of us. I'll try to be less long-winded. I did 2 main things. On the one hand, I started a band and I got a regular gig at a restaurant with my band, a weekly gig. So I was making a name as a band leader, and I was working on band leading concepts like composition, announcing tunes, rehearsing a band, all of those things. Simultaneously, I was going to jam sessions almost every night, going to different ones, seeing which ones I liked. That helped me in terms of what tunes do I need to know, standards. It helped me get connected to the scene, introduced to musicians like Jeremy Pelt that I ended up recording and touring with. It introduced me to a whole new peer group that became the people that I play with now in my band and people who hire me for their bands. So my approach was mostly those 2 things: start a band, get a gig somewhere, and go to jam sessions to try to get hired by other musicians. I also was teaching. So that, I guess that was the 3rd prong, which is I very actively pursued teaching opportunities to try to make money in the meantime.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Roxy. I feel like for me, I really was super fortunate because I moved to New York to play with Roxy and the Diva Jazz Orchestra in a show that the Diva Jazz Orchestra was playing off Broadway. So I moved to New York with a job, which is super rare and really, really amazing. But once that ended, then it was kind of like, oh, what do I do now? And so similarly, I was pursuing teaching opportunities because that's something that was really important to me. And I was able to get that to pan out. And that was from word of mouth, letting people know that you're in the area and that you're available, really trying to rekindle any connections with people that you had met previously, whether it was at, a conference like Jen or, they were a guest artist when you were in the school somewhere, just kind of trying to make the most of those introductions. And then I was kind of scared of jam sessions, but what I did do was go out and support people at their shows or go to people's shows who I knew, or some of those, maybe some of those connections or guest artists that I wanted to reconnect with. Maybe I went to their shows and just like reintroduced myself afterwards and said how much I enjoyed it. And then that's just like, your face is around, people are recognizing you, recognizing that you're here. And hopefully if they know kind of where you're coming from or they've heard you before, they trust you, they know you're reliable, they know what you sound like, and they are comfortable passing you a gig or a free rehearsal to sub or something like that. And eventually that gets you in the door and more things hopefully will start coming. So hope that's helpful.
However you find comfortable. Like I was also afraid of jam sessions, and after like 2 years of being afraid, I was like, okay, I'm just going to do this. But whatever you're comfortable with, I think the main idea is be seen and be heard. People aren't going to hire you if they don't know you exist, and they're not going to hire you if they don't know you can play. So make sure you're working on your playing, but also getting yourself out there, however that means for you. For me, it was so long ago now that the only thing I could do was record a CD and hand out physical CDs to people. Like, this is how you said, this is what I sound like. Nowadays, luckily, you can make yourself known how you sound, whether it's on your website or your Instagram or things like this. There's a way to have people hear you that's not so prohibitive. So one last question from Braden. Thank you, Braden. When you're looking for more artists to listen to, typically lesser known compared to some of the greats, how do you go about discovering and digging through unique sounds and records to find more players to listen to? I think you've already answered your own question. I think it can be a fun rabbit hole, right? Like if you hear a record, I always say, who's on this? Who is that? Who's that saxophone player? And then sometimes you're either going to start to recognize who these people are, or you're going to find new ones. And so if you hear of somebody that you haven't heard before, see if they have their own record. And again, these days it's easier. I used to have to go to Barnes and Noble and thumb through the CDs to try to find something, but now you can just type it in Google and find a YouTube video or whatever, put it in Apple Music or whatever you use. But the harder part is that the lineup isn't listed in these digital formats. So sometimes you have to actually do a pretty good Google search to find out who those people are, but it's worth it because that's how you can find more musicians. And then who did they play with and who did they play with and who were their influences? I also use, like I'll go in Apple Music and just go to browse, go to jazz. If there's something I've never heard of, I'll take a listen. Sometimes they only get one track and I don't like it, but sometimes I end up listening to the whole record and then I know what that sound is about. So I like to, as much as possible, it's hard, but I like to keep up with my peers and make sure I know like what's happening currently too.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. I think that's it. I love it.
Well, I think we're just about out of time, but I want to thank you both for not only great conversation and insights tonight, but the last couple months and all the fun activities we've had.